There is an ancient law among the wolves. A law older than kingdoms. Older than blood feuds. Older than the iron thrones built on the bones of the vanquished. It says this. Rejection breaks a werewolf's soul. It leaves them gasping for breath and begging for mercy. The rejected one collapses. The rejected one weeps. The rejected one, if they are weak enough, if the bond was deep enough, simply stops existing altogether. Every wolf in every territory knows this truth. They teach it to their pups. They whisper it as a warning. They have watched it happen in the great halls, in the cold courtyards, on muddy battlefields where warriors who survived 100 swords were brought to their knees by nothing more than 3 spoken words. I reject you. 3 words. And the world ends. But on the night of the 12th of Frostfall, in the year 1412, inside the towering stone halls of Ethelgard Keep, something different happened. On that night, the most powerful Alpha King the continent had ever seen stood before a ragged kitchen girl, drew himself to his full terrifying height, and spoke those 3 words in front of his entire court. And the girl laughed. Not because she was broken. Not because she was mad. But because she knew something that no one in that glittering viper-filled court had figured out yet. She was not the one who should be afraid. To understand what happened that night, you must first understand the world in which it happened. The werewolf kingdoms of the northern territories were not a gentle place. They were a collection of hard, blood-soaked lands carved out of forests and mountains by warriors who believed, above all other things, that power was the only currency that mattered. If you were strong, you ruled. If you were weak, you served. The hierarchy was absolute, biological, and brutally enforced, embedded not just in law and tradition, but in the very magic that flowed through every wolf's veins. At the top of that hierarchy sat the alphas, the dominant ones. The born leaders whose inner wolves radiated a crushing, psychic authority that lesser wolves felt in their bones. An alpha's presence was a physical weight in a room. Their command was not merely an order, it was a compulsion. A wolf lower in the hierarchy could no more disobey a true alpha command than they could choose to stop breathing. Below the alphas sat the betas. Strong, reliable, the generals and the lieutenants of the pack structure. And at the very bottom, at the lowest rung of a hierarchy that had very little mercy for those who occupied it, sat the omegas. The omegas were the wolves born without dominance. The quiet ones. The ones who carried the pots and scrubbed the floors and absorbed the casual cruelties of those above them with bowed heads and lowered eyes. In the official histories written by Lecan scholars, the omegas were described in terms that made them sound almost like a different species entirely. They were referred to as the burdened ones, the necessary low, and in Lord Pendleton's private journals, most damning of all, the invisible. This is the world Maeve O'Callaghan had lived in for the better part of a decade. And she had been very, very good at being invisible. Now let us speak of Dominic Blackwood. If Maeve was a shadow, Dominic was a blazing fire that consumed everything it touched. At 28 years old, he had accomplished something that generations of Alpha Kings before him had failed to do. He had united the fractured packs of the East and the West under a single crown. He had done it through strategy, through war, and through the particular brand of ruthlessness that separated mere commanders from true conquerors. He was a striking man. Tall, broad, built from the brutal demands of a life spent on campaign. His hair was dark. His jaw was carved like the cliffs of the northern coast. And his eyes, those famous stormy grey eyes that his court spoke of in reverent, fearful whispers, were the eyes of a man who had looked into the face of terrible decisions and made them without flinching. His court was magnificent and treacherous in equal measure. Ethelgard Keep, his seat of power, was a monument to dominance, a fortress of soaring vaulted ceilings, intricate stone-carved tapestries depicting ancient battles, and hearths large enough to roast an ox whole. It was a place that had been built to communicate one simple message to everyone who entered it: bow down. But for all his power, for all his conquered territories and sworn bannermen, Dominic Blackwood had a problem. Legitimacy. You see, the ancient laws of Lecan sovereignty were very clear. True dominion, the kind that made wolves obey not just out of fear but out of deep, bone-level biological recognition, could only be granted by the bloodline of the firstborns. The Sterling line. The original wolves, the descendants of the first creature ever touched by the moon's magic, whose silver eyes and pure blood were said to be the literal anchor point for all Lecan power on Earth. Without the Sterling blessing, a king was just a very dangerous man with a very large army. And the Sterlings, everyone knew, were gone. 50 years before, Dominic's grandfather, the original Blackwood conqueror, had launched what history recorded as the Crimson Purge. A systematic, brutal campaign to eradicate the Sterling bloodline entirely, to sever the old order and replace it with the raw, uncomplicated power of Blackwood dominance. It had been, by every account available, successful. The Sterlings were dead. Their silver-eyed, moon-blessed legacy was buried under 50 years of dirt and deliberate forgetting. So Dominic did what powerful men without true legitimacy have always done throughout history. He decided to manufacture it through marriage. Lady Arabella Hastings of the Silver Pine Pack was, by any objective measure, the perfect political solution. She was stunning in the way that high-born wolves often were. Sharp features, expensive clothes, the kind of beauty that had been curated and maintained like a weapon. She commanded a standing army of 3,000 battle-hardened wolves. Her father's lands in the Western Territories were among the most productive in the continent. And she was, crucially, willing, even eager, to become the Queen of Ethelgard. The mating ball was arranged for the 12th of Frostfall. Nobles traveled from across the continent to attend. Lords and ladies who had spent generations feuding over borders and trade routes arrived at Ethelgard's gates in their finest silks, bearing gifts, bearing ambitions, and bearing the particular kind of sharp, hungry attention that wolves always brought into a room where power was about to change hands. Lord Silas Montgomery arrived with his retinue of 40 wolves and enough gifted wine to fill a small river. Lady Beatrice Graves came with 3 trunks of silver jewelry and a reputation for knowing everyone's secrets. Court historian Lord Arthur Pendleton brought his ever-present leather journal and the careful, observant eyes that would one day be responsible for recording what actually happened that night. The Great Hall of Ethelgard was breathtaking. Torchlight bounced off the stone walls in warm, dancing waves. Long tables groaned under the weight of roasted venison, honeyed fruits, spiced mead, and the kinds of elaborate pastries that only the wealthiest kitchens could produce. The air was thick with the combined scents of hundreds of dominant wolves, musk and pine and iron and ambition, layered over each other until the atmosphere in the hall felt almost physically heavy. At the high dais, elevated above his court on the great stone throne of Ethelgard, sat Dominic Blackwood. He was speaking to Lady Arabella, who stood at his side in a gown of deep crimson, her dark hair pinned with silver combs. She was laughing at something he had said. To all observers, the evening was proceeding exactly as scripted. The king would formalize the bond tonight. The alliance would be sealed. The Silver Pine army would become Blackwood's army. Everything was going according to plan. And then a frantic steward made a mistake. Deep in the soot-stained bowels of Ethelgard's kitchens, there was a girl. She was not memorable. That was, in fact, the entire point. Maeve O'Callaghan, as she was known to the head cook, was the kind of person that a room full of powerful wolves looked straight through. She wore rough-spun wool, perpetually stained with hearth ash. Her hair was pulled back in a practical, unlovely knot. Her face was almost always smudged with soot, her hands perpetually reddened from the lye soap used to scrub the heavy iron cookware. She kept her head down. She absorbed the casual cruelties of her station, the shoves and the thrown plate scraps and the cutting remarks from higher-ranked servants, with the patience of someone who had made an absolute peace with invisibility. No one looked at her twice. And that was, if anyone had been paying close enough attention to notice, deeply, profoundly strange. Because here is what was also true about Maeve. Despite a decade of alleged malnutrition and hard labor, her spine never curved. Not once. She stood straight, even when everyone around her was hunching in deference. There was something in the set of her shoulders, just barely perceptible, just on the edge of awareness, that was more like a queen at rest than a servant at work. The kitchen hounds, massive, territorial beasts that answered to no one easily, grew quiet when Maeve was near. Not just quiet. They became still, watchful, as if in the presence of something their animal instincts recognized and could not categorize. And sometimes, in the deep quiet of the early mornings when the kitchen was empty and Maeve stood alone by the great hearth, staring into the fire, the flame seemed to lean toward her. Just slightly. Just for a moment. As if they, too, were paying attention. But no one noticed. Because Maeve O'Callaghan had spent 10 years perfecting the art of not being noticed. On the night of the mating ball, a frantic steward, overwhelmed by the complexity of serving 300 nobles simultaneously, made a decision he would spend the rest of his life regretting. He thrust a heavy silver platter of honeyed fowl into Maeve's hands and shoved her toward the great hall with instructions to deliver it to the high table. It was a breach of protocol. An oversight. A mistake so ordinary and forgettable that no one would have remembered it at all. Except for what happened next. Maeve moved through the crowd with her head down and her eyes on the flagstones. The great hall was a sensory assault. The roar of 300 voices, the crash of goblets, the overlapping waves of dominant wolf musk so thick it was almost visible. She navigated through the bodies by instinct, the silver platter balanced on both hands, weaving toward the high dais with the practiced efficiency of someone who had been invisible long enough to know how to move through a crowd without being touched. She was almost there. And then the doors at the far end of the hall blew open. It was just a draft. A winter gust cutting through the stone corridors of the keep. An unremarkable event. The kind of thing that happened 100 times a night in a drafty fortress during frostfall. Except that this particular gust caught Maeve from behind. It swept across her, lifting the heavy smells of the kitchen, the grease, the garlic, the lye soap, straight off her skin and carrying them away into the cold air behind her. And in their place, for one unguarded, unmasked, absolute moment, her true scent was released into the great hall. It moved like a living thing. It smelled of rain-soaked earth after a summer storm. Ancient pine resin, the kind that comes from trees so old they remember the first wolves. And underneath both of those, crackling lightning. Raw. Electric. Like the moment before the sky tears itself apart. At the high dais, Dominic Blackwood stopped mid-sentence. His goblet of wine slipped from his fingers. The crystal shattered against the flagstones. The sound was very small in the roar of the hall, but the 30 people closest to the high table heard it, and they turned to look, because Dominic Blackwood did not drop things. Inside his chest, his inner wolf, the terrifying, continent-conquering beast that had never once bowed its head in submission to anything, slammed against the cage of his ribs with enough force to make him stagger, and roared 2 words. Mate. Mine. The words echoed in the deepest chambers of his soul. Not a whisper. Not a suggestion. An absolute, biological, bone-deep declaration that drowned out every other thought in his mind like a wave swallowing a candle. His stormy eyes swept the room. Past the glittering lords. Past the preening ladies. Past Arabella, who was reaching for his arm with a confused frown. Past everything that glittered and preened and demanded his attention. Until his gaze landed on the ragged servant girl with the silver platter. The silence that fell over the great hall was not immediate. It spread outward from Dominic like a stone dropped into still water, a ripple of stunned, confused, horrified quiet that moved from the high table through the crowd until, within the space of perhaps 30 seconds, 300 wolves were standing motionless and speechless, watching their fearsome alpha king descend the steps of the dais like a man in a trance. His movements were stiff, predatory, pulled forward by something invisible and utterly unbreakable. Maeve stopped walking. She did not drop the platter. Her knuckles went white around its edge, but she held it steady. And she felt it, the ancient pull of the fated bond clicking into place like a lock finding its key. A warmth that spread from the center of her chest outward, steady and inevitable and deeply, achingly familiar. She felt it. And her eyes went very still. Of all the wolves in all the kingdoms, of all the possible outcomes of 10 years spent hiding, surviving, waiting, the moon had chosen him. The grandson of the man who had ordered the murder of everyone she had ever loved. Dominic stopped inches from her. He was close enough that she could feel the heat radiating from his chest. He towered over her, by a foot perhaps more, his breathing audible and uneven. His inner wolf was screaming at him with an urgency that bypassed rational thought entirely. Claim her. Keep her. She is yours and you are hers, and there is nothing in the world more important than this moment right now. He leaned in. His nose brushed the crook of her neck. He inhaled. The court gasped as one. Lady Arabella Hastings rose from the high table. Her face had gone from confused to furious to something approaching dangerous. Behind her, Lord Montgomery leaned toward Lady Beatrice Graves with a whisper that carried far too easily in the sudden silence. An Omega? The king is mated to an ash-covered rat. Dominic pulled back. His expression was a war. She could see it happening in real time. The profound, undeniable pull of the bond fighting against every calculation he had ever made, every political alliance he had ever built, every carefully constructed piece of the image he had spent a decade forging. His wolf wanted her. His wolf would have walked through fire for her. His wolf was a desperate, whimpering, wanting creature in that moment in a way it had never been before. But Dominic Blackwood was not just a wolf. He was a king. He saw her ragged clothes, her soot-smudged face, the complete and utter absence of any visible power in her posture, her scent, her station. To mate an Omega was political suicide. It would make him a laughingstock across 3 territories. It would cost him Arabella's army. It would cost him the one strategic alliance that could finally silence the whispers about the illegitimacy of his throne. His jaw hardened. "What is your name, creature?" he said. His voice was smooth and cold and layered with enough contempt to make several of the nearby lords flinch on reflex. Maeve looked at him. Not at his boots. Not at the floor. Not with the reflexive, submissive downward cast of every Omega in every room she had ever stood in. She looked him dead in the eye. "Maeve," she said. Softly. Steadily. Dominic's eyes narrowed. And then he squared his shoulders, and he tapped into the full, crushing weight of his alpha authority, and he spoke the ancient words of rejection into the silent, watching hall. "I, Dominic Blackwood, Alpha King of the Unified Territories, look upon you, Maeve, and find you unworthy. I reject you as my fated mate. I reject you as my Luna. I sever the cord that binds our souls, now and for all eternity." The words landed. According to pack law and every documented account of Lecan biology going back 3 centuries, what should have happened next was very clear. An Omega, upon receiving rejection from an Alpha, especially a rejection of that magnitude, spoken with that authority, in front of that many dominant wolves, should have collapsed. The mate bond severing was a violence done to the soul's deepest fabric. Omegas had been known to hemorrhage. Their minds had been known to shatter from the combined grief and magical trauma of the separation. The court braced themselves. Lord Pendleton averted his eyes. He would write later that he simply could not bear to watch. The silence dragged. 1 second. 2. 3. Maeve slowly lowered the silver platter. She placed it on a nearby oak table with a small, deliberate clink. She dusted her rough woolen skirt with both hands. And then a sound escaped her lips. It began low. A rumbling, resonant chuckle that seemed to come from somewhere very deep in her chest. A place that had nothing to do with nerves or shock or the desperate attempt to hold herself together in the face of devastation. The chuckle built. It rose up through her throat, and it grew, and it kept growing, until she threw her head back and a full, rich, echoing laugh erupted from her. Not hysterical, not broken, not the crazed sound of a fractured mind, but genuine, warm, deeply, impossibly amused. And laced underneath that warmth, like steel beneath silk, was something that sent a cold shudder racing down the spine of every seasoned warrior in the room. A predatory edge. 300 wolves felt it in their bones before they could name it. Before a single one of them could look at each other and say, "That is not the sound an Omega makes." Dominic took a half-step back. "You reject me?" Maeve asked. And then her voice changed. It was subtle at first. Just a slight doubling of her voice, as if a second speaker were layered beneath the first, speaking the exact same words at the exact same moment from somewhere much older and much deeper. Dominic's chest seized. Blinding, burning agony ripped through his collarbone, right where a mate mark would have formed, with the force of something tearing. He staggered. His hand flew to his chest. A sharp, involuntary gasp tore from his throat. "Dominic!" Arabella shrieked. She lunged forward to reach him. A wave of invisible force hit her like a wall. She flew backward, crashed into a banquet table. Goblets went spinning. A whole roasted fowl hit the stone floor. She lay there, stunned, staring at the ceiling. "What is happening?" Lord Montgomery roared, drawing his broadsword. "I accept your rejection, Dominic Blackwood," Maeve said. Her voice had dropped an entire octave. It carried weight now. Physical, actual weight, like the resonance of shifting tectonic plates deep beneath the earth. "But you clearly do not understand how the bond works." She took one step forward. "You cannot reject the soil from which you grow." Another step. "You cannot reject the moon that pulls your tides." And as she spoke, the glamour she had worn like a second skin for 10 years began to come apart. It did not happen all at once. It happened the way dawn comes, not a sudden event but a gradual, unstoppable revelation, each second brighter than the last. The ash and soot flaked from her skin, not like dirt washing away but like a chrysalis cracking open, revealing something pale and flawless beneath. Her hunched posture, the carefully maintained deliberate curve of an Omega's submission, straightened. Her spine extended. Her chin lifted. And somehow, impossibly, she seemed to grow, not taller exactly, but larger, as if the space around her were contracting to make room for what she actually was. Her rough wool dress darkened as though absorbing shadow, wrapping around her changing form in deep, midnight folds. But it was her scent that brought the room to its knees. The faint, kitchen-mask trace of rain and ancient pine that had first staggered Dominic exploded outward into something that was not a scent so much as a force. A suffocating, intoxicating hurricane of absolute dominance that hit every wolf in the room simultaneously and drove every instinct they possessed straight into the earth. It was ancient in a way that had no analogy. It was the kind of power that did not belong to a single individual but to a lineage. Centuries upon centuries of sovereign magic, compressed and bottled and kept hidden, now suddenly, violently released into the stone-walled confines of Ethelgard's great hall. The very air grew thick. Silas Montgomery's broadsword clattered to the flagstones as both his knees hit the ground. His hands slapped the stone, and he stayed there, panting. Lord Pendleton collapsed sideways from his chair, weeping openly. His inner wolf submitting to a power it recognized from somewhere so deep in its genetic memory that the response bypassed conscious thought entirely. The great hearths, the roaring, crackling fires that had been blazing cheerfully all evening, dimmed. Not from lack of fuel. Not from a draught. They dimmed the way a lesser light dims in the presence of a greater one. Bowing. Acknowledging. Dominic fell to one knee. His hands went to his throat. He was suffocating not from lack of air but from the crushing, unrelenting pressure of an aura that made his own, the aura that had made grown alphas weep and continents surrender, feel like a child's drawing of a storm standing next to the actual storm itself. His wolf, the undefeated beast, curled into a ball in the back of his mind and went silent. Maeve stepped closer to the kneeling king. She reached down. With a single finger, she tilted his chin upward. He looked up at her, and his stormy gray eyes went wide with a terror he had never felt in his entire life. Not on battlefields, not in the face of death, not in any of the 1,000 dangerous moments his conquest had led him through. Because her eyes were no longer brown. They burned silver. Incandescent. Luminous. The legendary mark of the firstborn bloodline, blazing in her face like 2 small moons. "You called me a cosmic error," Maeve whispered. The dual resonance of her voice vibrated through his bones and into the stone beneath his knees. "You called me an omega. Tell me, little king, does your wolf feel like he is in the presence of an omega?" Dominic choked. Blood trickled from his nose under the pressure of her aura. "How?" he managed. His voice was barely a thread. "The Sterlings. They were burned. My grandfather." "Your grandfather," Maeve said. "Missed one." She released his chin. Stepped back. And when she spoke again, her voice filled the hall from floor to vaulted ceiling, reaching into every corner, heard clearly by every soul present. "My name is Maeve Sterling. I am the last of the Leaken sovereigns. The blood of the first wolf flows in my veins, and the magic of our entire species is anchored to my soul." The silence that followed was absolute. "The mate bond," Maeve continued, her silver gaze moving slowly, deliberately across the room of groveling nobles, "was the moon's final mercy on your bloodline, Dominic. It was an offer. An outstretched hand. By accepting me, by choosing the bond over your pride, you would have legitimized your stolen throne. You would have stood beside the source of all Leaken power. You would have become a god among men." She looked down at him. "But you rejected me." Dominic's breathing was ragged. He could feel something happening inside him, a sensation he had no name for because he had never in his life experienced it. His wolf, the enormous, terrifying engine of his power, was fading, draining away into the cold stone, like water disappearing into dry earth. "And in doing so," Maeve said, "you severed yourself from the source. You didn't break my heart, Dominic. A beat. You broke your own wolf." The scream that tore from Dominic Blackwood was the most terrible sound Lord Pendleton ever committed to his journal. Raw. Guttural. The sound of something profound and essential being ripped away. His muscles twitched and spasmed. His fangs, those famous fearsome fangs, retracted and did not return. The golden glow of his alpha status sputtered in his eyes like a candle caught in a gale, flickering once, twice, and then going out entirely, leaving his eyes flat, dull and gray. In the space of 60 seconds, the most powerful alpha king on the continent became an ordinary man. Lady Arabella, still pinned to the ground by Maeve's aura, watched this happen with her mouth open and tears of horror streaming silently down her face. Maeve Sterling straightened. She looked out over her hall, her court, her keep. 300 wolves lay prostrate before her, not from fear of punishment, not from political calculation, but from the deep, helpless, biological recognition of their true sovereign. Their inner wolves had already decided. Their inner wolves were already home. "My reign begins tonight," Maeve said. Her voice was quiet. She did not need to shout. The dual resonance of the Sterling blood carried her words into every corner of the vast hall, heard as clearly by the Lord pinned to the back wall as by the guard kneeling at her feet. "Anyone who wishes to challenge my claim to the throne of Ethelgard may stand and do so now." Not a single soul moved. They could not. The weight of the last Sterling held them with a gravity as absolute and irresistible as the moon holds the tides. Maeve looked down at Dominic one last time. He was shivering. Without his wolf, The cold of the stone floor had become something he could feel in a way he never had before. He looked smaller than she had ever seen him. Not in stature, but in substance. You wanted a queen who could stand in the blood of her enemies, Maeve said softly. Not cruelly. Simply. Accurately. Look around you, Dominic. I don't even need to spill a drop to conquer them. She turned her back on the broken king. And she walked toward the high dais, her steps echoing in the profound, breathless silence of the hall, each footfall a small, certain drumbeat marking the beginning of something new. The age of the false kings was over. The transition of power at Ethelgard Keep was documented in meticulous detail by archivist William Rutherford, a man whose ink-stained parchments dated the 14th of Frostfall would later become the primary historical record of the night the Lecan hierarchy was rewritten. Rutherford wrote that the morning after the mating ball felt as though the very earth was holding its breath. Dominic Blackwood, the conqueror, the iron-fisted unifier, the man whose name had been whispered across 3 territories as synonymous with unstoppable power, was practically carried from the great hall, weeping and clawing at his chest. The severing of the fated bond to a firstborn had not killed him. That would have been too simple, and the moon, it seemed, had a sense of poetic justice. Instead, it had silenced his inner wolf. Without his wolf, Dominic lost everything that had made him what he was. The accelerated healing that had let him survive wounds that would have killed ordinary men. The supernatural strength that had let him lift a destrier off a fallen soldier during the Battle of the Iron Pass. The intoxicating alpha command that had kept 3 territories of ambitious, violent, rival lords in something approximating order. He was, now, simply a man. And Queen Maeve's first official act as sovereign of Ethelgard was this. She stripped him of his titles, his silks, his sword, his rooms in the East Tower with their views of the mountains and their imported Southland rugs. And she assigned him to the scullery. The man who had ruled the continent was tasked with scraping rendered fat from roasting spits, wearing the exact same rough-spun wool that Maeve had worn for a decade. The court gossips would whisper about this moment for centuries. Not because it was cruel, though it was, with a specific, precise cruelty of perfect symmetry, but because it was so completely, devastatingly appropriate. But the story was not over. Power vacuums do not go unfilled. And humiliation in wolves has a way of curdling quickly into something far more dangerous. Lady Arabella Hastings fled Ethelgard Keep before dawn, riding hard through the frozen dark with her personal guard, galloping toward the western borders and her father's lands with her fury burning hotter than any forge fire. Lord Reginald Hastings was exactly the kind of man his daughter had always needed him to be. Proud, bitter, blinded by ambition, and possessed of a standing army of 3,000 battle-hardened wolves who answered to his banner without question. Arabella's account of what had happened at the mating ball was not entirely accurate. In her telling, there was no ancient bloodline revealed. No silver eyes. No biological submission of 300 wolves to a power older than kingdoms. In Arabella's version, there was a dark witch. A blood magic practitioner who had used forbidden sorcery to poison Dominic and cast a mass illusion over the court. An impostor and a usurper who had stolen the throne through deception and needed to be removed before her madness spread further. Reginald believed her. Or perhaps more precisely, Reginald wanted to believe her, because believing her meant that the woman currently sitting on the throne of Ethelgard was a fraud rather than a sovereign, and that meant the throne was still available, and that his daughter could still be queen, and that 3,000 wolves and all their associated lands and taxes and tribute could still end up under Hastings' banner. He called his banners. The war drums began to beat across the frost-bitten valleys. Inside Ethelgard, the atmosphere was a volatile mixture of reverence and panic. The highborn lords had sworn fealty to Maeve. Their wolves had given them no choice. But whispers of an approaching army spread through the keep like smoke under a door. 3,000 wolves against whatever disorganized forces Ethelgard could muster. The math was not encouraging. It was in this moment of crisis that General Alistair Reed stepped out of the shadows. Alistair Reed was not a man who made dramatic entrances. He was the commander of Ethelgard's vanguard, massive, scarred, with eyes like chipped obsidian and a reputation among his soldiers for speaking only when he had something worth saying. He had served Dominic faithfully and professionally, and with a sort of complete personal opacity that made him difficult to read and therefore difficult to manipulate. But here is what the historical record reveals, from the keep's quartermaster's accounts, confirmed across 3 separate sets of ledgers. For 3 winters running, extra firewood had been quietly requisitioned and delivered to the scullery doors on the coldest nights. Thick woolen blankets, significantly finer quality than anything an Omega would ordinarily be issued, had appeared at regular intervals near the kitchen sleeping quarters. There was no official authorization for these requisitions. The ledgers simply recorded them as general's discretionary provisions, and no one had thought to question it. Because no one had been paying attention to the scullery, and no one had been paying attention to the quiet, unassuming girl who worked there. Except Alistair Reed. He had seen the way the hunting hounds grew still in her presence. He had watched, over 3 winters of careful, unannounced observation, the way she moved through the kitchens, the straightness of her spine, the quiet authority in her stillness, the sense that she was not simply enduring her circumstances but inhabiting them deliberately, like someone who had chosen invisibility as a strategy rather than been assigned it by fate. He had recognized majesty long before the ash fell from her face. Now, as the War Council descended into barely controlled panic around the heavy oak table in the map room, with lords talking over each other and calculating terrible odds and suggesting increasingly desperate strategies, Alistair Reed walked to the front of the room. He bypassed the frantic lords entirely. He dropped to one knee before Maeve. He drew his broadsword and laid it flat on the stone at her feet. The room went silent. For 3 years, Alistair said, his deep voice carrying the particular quality of absolute conviction. Not performance, not politics, but truth. I watched you carry the burdens of this keep in silence. I knew you were more than what they saw. He looked up at her. My wolf has never bowed to Dominic Blackwood. But he bows to you, my queen. My life, my blade, and my absolute loyalty belong to the last Sterling. In the war room, surrounded by panicking lords and the distant faint rhythm of war drums growing slowly closer, Maeve Sterling looked down at the battle-scarred general kneeling at her feet. And for the first time since the night of her claiming, the cold, predatory precision in her silver eyes softened. She reached out. Her fingers touched his pauldron. And the world shifted. A jolt of pure, warm electricity moved between them. Not the demanding, urgent crash of the first bond, but something deeper and slower and more certain. The scent of crackling lightning and rain-soaked earth met dark cedar and old steel and wrapped around both of them, intertwining so naturally that it felt less like a new connection forming and more like a recognition. Like 2 things that had always belonged together finally being placed in the same room. The room went perfectly still. A second chance. The moon, in its wisdom, had not merely severed a toxic bond. It had cleared the wreckage to reveal the foundation that had been waiting underneath. Rise, General Reed, Maeve said softly. And then she smiled, fierce and beautiful and entirely genuine, and said, Gather the men. But tell them to keep their swords sheathed. The Silverpine pack marches to their own defeat, and I will not lose a single one of my own to prove a point. The dawn of the 17th of Frostfall was painted in bruised purples and bloody reds, the kind of sky that old soldiers read as an omen. Outside the towering walls of Ethelgard, 3,000 wolves assembled in perfect formation. Their breath rose in thick white columns against the freezing air. Siege engines were hauled into position. Battering rams waited at the ready. At the head of the army sat Lord Reginald Hastings on a massive black warhorse, and beside him, wrapped in rich furs, her face set in a mask of cold fury, rode Lady Arabella Hastings. She looked up at the battlements of Ethelgard with the expression of a woman who had decided, with absolute certainty, that she was about to get everything she was owed. The magically amplified thunder of Reginald's voice rolled across the snow-covered plains, shaking icicles from the parapets. "Bring out the witch. Surrender the usurper, and the rest of you shall be shown mercy. Defy me, and we shall paint these walls with your blood." The great iron portcullis of Ethelgard groaned upward. The chains rattled and strained. And instead of an army, instead of the desperate, disorganized defensive force that every military mind in the War Council had agreed was Ethelgard's only option, two figures walked out of the dark tunnel of the gatehouse into the cold morning light. Just two. Maeve Sterling wore no armor. She wore a sweeping cloak of silver fox fur that caught the pale winter light and threw it back in soft, rippling waves, and it mirrored, almost exactly, the terrifying, luminous glow of her silver eyes. Beside her walked General Alistair Reed, one hand resting with practiced casualness on the pommel of his sword. His dark eyes moving steadily, constantly, across the assembled army with the calm, measuring attention of a man who had faced worse odds and come home from all of them. Arabella stared at them for a moment. Then she laughed. It was a shrill, mocking sound. The laugh of someone who genuinely could not believe what she was seeing. "Look at her, father. She brings a single guard to face our entire might. She is insane." Reginald raised his hand. "Archers." 1,000 bows came up simultaneously, the creak of taut wood filling the crisp morning air like a terrible wooden chorus. "Knock." Alistair stepped forward, placing his body between Maeve and 1,000 arrows. Ready to take the volley. Completely prepared for this to be the last morning of his life, Maeve placed a hand flat on his chest and moved him aside. Gently. Firmly. Without looking at him. "You forget yourselves," she said. She said it quietly. She did not amplify her voice. She did not shout across the plains or reach for any of the dramatic gestures that the moment seemed to demand. Instead, she closed her eyes. She drew in a slow breath of freezing morning air. And she reached down through the layers of herself. Past the 10 years of hiding. Past the careful, controlled containment of a decade of invisibility. Past the grief and the patience and the long, cold nights of waiting. Down to the root of her. Down to the place where the magic of the Sterling bloodline lived. Not merely in her blood but in the invisible threads of Lecan ancestry that connected every wolf on the continent, every wolf who had ever lived, back to the single original creature that had first been touched by the moon's light. The Sovereign's network. The threads that connected every wolf to every other wolf, all of them ultimately anchored to the same source. She was the source. She opened her eyes. The silver light blazed. And she unleashed the Sovereign's command. It was not a sound. It was not a voice. It was something that existed in a register entirely beyond human hearing. A psychic shockwave, a concussive blast of pure ancient authority that detonated outward across the snow-covered plains like a wave from a stone dropped into still water. The impact was instantaneous. 3,000 wolves, battle-hardened, experienced, disciplined, did not simply lower their weapons. They screamed. Their inner wolves seized control. Not gently, not gradually, but violently, prioritizing biological survival over political allegiance in the way that only the most primordial instincts can. The sound that filled the valley was the sound of thousands of bodies changing simultaneously. Bones breaking and reforming. Muscles reshaping. The collective groan and crack and roar of forced transformation that echoed off the distant mountains and probably woke every living thing within 10 miles. Where an army of 3,000 human-form wolves had stood in ordered rows, there was suddenly a sea of massive, terrifying dire wolves. And not a single one of them was attacking. They were trembling. They were whimpering. One by one, then in waves, then all at once, 3,000 dire wolves dropped to their bellies in the snow. They crawled forward, dragging their chins through the frozen earth, exposing their vulnerable throats to the silver-eyed woman who stood alone between the gates and the army, her fox fur cloak barely moving in the still morning air. Reginald's warhorse buckled and threw him. He hit the snow hard, scrambled upright, and drew his sword with shaking hands, but his own wolf was clawing at the inside of his skull, screaming, "Submit, submit, submit," and he fell to his knees, retching from the pressure, his sword hand dropping until the blade rested uselessly in the snow. Arabella lasted slightly longer. She fought it with every ounce of pride and fury she possessed. And then her wolf simply overpowered her, forcing her down, pressing her perfectly styled hair into the muddy snow, driving her forehead to the earth at Maeve's feet as Maeve walked slowly through the sea of prostrated beasts toward the woman who had made her life in the kitchens a specific, targeted misery for the better part of 3 years. "You brought an army to my doorstep," Maeve said. Her voice carried across the valley, heard clearly by every submitting wolf. "To accuse me of witchcraft." She looked at Arabella. "You forgot the first rule of our kind, Arabella. The blood remembers." She straightened. She looked out over the 3,000 wolves lying still and surrendered in the snow. "The Silverpine pack is hereby absorbed into the Royal Guard." She looked at the shaking form of Reginald, kneeling in the cold. "Reginald Hastings, you are stripped of your lands and your title." And then she looked down at Arabella. She remembered the throne plates, the careless, casual kicks, the years of quiet, inventive cruelty that highborn wolves inflicted on those they considered beneath them. "As for you, Arabella," a pause, "you will take my place in the scullery. I hear Dominic Blackwood is struggling to keep the hearth fires lit. Perhaps you can assist him." The silence that followed was broken only by Arabella's wail, a raw, pathetic sound of genuine horror that rose into the cold morning sky and was swallowed quickly by the wind. Maeve turned her back on the defeated lord and lady and walked back toward the gates of her keep. The sea of wolves parted before her, 3,000 heads remaining pressed to the earth as she passed, not daring to lift until she was gone. At the gatehouse, General Alistair Reed was waiting. He stood completely straight, completely unaffected by the sovereign's command, because the bond between true mates is older even than the bloodline's authority, and it does not bow to the same forces that move other wolves. He held out his hand. His dark eyes, looking at her, held everything he had not yet said in words. Maeve took his hand. She felt the electric warmth of their bond settle around her like the return of something that had been missing for so long she had nearly forgotten what its presence felt like. Warm. Certain. Real. "Come, Alistair," she said quietly. "We have a kingdom to rebuild." She glanced at him. "And a very long winter to survive. Together." They walked back through the gates of Ethelgard Keep. The heavy iron portcullis descended behind them. The dawn continued to break over the snow-covered plains, pale and cold and new, falling on 3,000 wolves slowly returning to themselves in the quiet. Changed, all of them, in the specific way that living through a revelation changes a person. They had come to destroy a queen. They had found a sovereign. Archivist William Rutherford, writing in the careful, meticulous hand of a man who understood that he was witnessing something that would be studied for centuries, recorded the events of Frostfall, 1412, in 12 separate volumes. He wrote about the mating ball, and the rejection, and the laughter that preceded the revelation. He wrote about the broken king in the scullery, and the disgraced lady scraping fat from the roasting spits. He wrote about the morning the Silverpine army knelt in the snow without a single sword being drawn. But the passage that was most copied, most studied, most translated into the languages of every territory in the centuries that followed was the last entry he made in the 12th volume. It was written 3 months after the night of the mating ball, in the deep quiet of midwinter, when the snow was at its highest and the court had begun to understand that this was not a temporary disruption but the beginning of something genuinely new. Rutherford wrote, "She does not rule as he ruled. She does not command through the threat of what she might do. She commands through the weight of what she is. And what she is, the wolves of this court have decided, is the thing they have been missing without knowing it. Not a stronger alpha. Not a cleverer strategist. But a root. A source. A reason for the power to mean something beyond itself. The scullery girl who laughed in the face of rejection has become the silver sovereign we did not know we were waiting for. May the moon witness what has been begun here. The reign of the false kings is over. The age of the silver sovereign has begun. And the world of wolves was never the same again. And that, friends, is the story of Maeve Sterling, the last of the Lecan sovereigns, the woman who turned the cruelest moment of her life into the first breath of her destiny. She spent 10 years being invisible, being overlooked, being told in 100 different ways, by 100 different people, that she was small and forgettable and unworthy of notice. And she let them think so. She let them think so right up until the moment she was ready to remind them exactly what they had been standing next to all along. There is something about that story that stays with you. The patience of it. The quiet, unbreakable certainty. The knowledge that the right moment to reveal your power is not when someone demands it of you, but when you decide. If that kind of story moves you, if you want more tales of women who were underestimated and became legendary, more dark kingdoms and ancient bloodlines, and the kind of epic power reveals that make you want to rewind and watch the moment again, then this channel is exactly where you need to be. Every week, we bring you stories like this one. Long, rich, fully narrated fantasy epics that take their time, build their worlds, and deliver the kind of satisfying, deeply earned moments that stay with you long after the video ends. If you are new here, welcome. Hit that subscribe button right now. Turn on notifications so you never miss a new story. And drop a comment below telling me your favorite moment from Maeve's story. Was it the laugh? The unmasking? The moment she walked out of those gates alone to face 3,000 wolves? Tell me. I read every single one. If you have been here for a while, thank you. From the bottom of my heart. You are the reason these stories get told. And if you want to binge while you wait for the next one, check out the playlist linked right here. Every epic, every kingdom, every woman who refused to stay where they put her. The age of the Silver Sovereign has only just begun. I will see you in the next story.